I appreciate Nicole's giving us kind of the foundation of GMPs, this good manufacturing practices. And so that might not have been new for some of you, and it might have acted as a friendly reminder, or it might be introduced to you and knowing what we always declare this is like the foundational knowledge and the infrastructure that builds food safety practice effectively for your food. So whether you're cottage law food production today and growing, or you plan to stay there, this is the language that we use often, and making sure that we have good practices on the facility that we're starting with. So now I'm going to transition to the context of growing your business. So assuming that you all are working in the cottage food business at your home, we wanted to now discuss with you some of the things that you should be at least thinking about if you want your business to grow in the future. So this is by no means an end all be all, but the idea here is to kind of give you some forward thinking about things that you should start considering now so you can kind of grow into the role as your business grows. So during this module, we're going to discuss some of those preliminary food safety practices that can help manage the food safety hazards in your product. And we use this term often, food safety hazards. Every food has concerns, and we'll start talking about the terms that we use to be identifying what those hazards are so that you can find a way to control them to produce safe food. Then this is related to cottage if you're making things in your home or in large scale production, but this is the type of terminology that we're using when doing that. So we'll also introduce the different types of food safety regulations. For any of you that play Monopoly, I always feel like food safety is kind of like Monopoly, where the rules can change depending on what's on the board. And so in the context of, in Monopoly, if you've got all 4 of the railroads, the rent can be significantly different versus if you've got a hotel or only partial of the pieces, like how you play the game would be very different. In analogous to the food safety world, what type of food we're producing and how we are producing it will play a different regulation and or sometimes more regulations. So today we just want to introduce you to be asking those questions so that you can understand the different types of regulations that should be considered. And then we'll also start introducing you to some of the aspects of different food safety plan requirements for foods. So let's see here, in the world of processing facilities, if you are starting to look at a new venue beyond cottage laws, there's a lot of different places to go. You can use a shared use space. This is where you usually pay for services where they have all the equipment and you just rent it out at some sort of contract negotiated rate. You could pay someone to do the product for you. You give them the parameters and then they can run it for you. Or you can actually rent and or purchase your own product facility. So obviously we can't make those decisions for you, but understanding the different types of processing facilities is a very important decision as you consider scaling up, and everything has a pro and a con of how we make these informed decisions. Cost, time, money, expertise. The other thing we have to think about, and I had mentioned this before, is what are the applicable regulations that you have? So in the United States, we have 2 regulators, the FDA and the USDA. And so USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, they're responsible for meat, poultry, and egg products that are out of shell or managing the quality of eggs. Whereas the FDA, the Food Drug Administration, they regulate all other food products. So that includes dietary supplements, bottled water, food additives, and infant formula. So just as a reminder here, if you're using, we're not going to go into all of these different nuances here, but do know 2 different regulators and depending on what you're making. So for example, if I was an empanada company, which is a company that actually Nicole and I have worked with in the past, they make vegetarian empanadas, but they also make meat-based empanadas. And so they had 2 regulations because they had a vegetarian product and a meat product. So just understanding the nuances is very important. To add to that level of regulation in the world of food processing, particularly for wholesale licensing, there's a variety of federal regulations. So as I mentioned, the FDA and the USDA oversee these regulations, but depending on the product, you'll have a different food safety regulation. So for example, here, gotta get my little laser pointer out, HACCP, a term you might be familiar with, it refers to hazard analysis of critical control points. And it's a food safety plan that's required by law for products like juice under FDA, seafood under FDA, and meat and poultry products, which is USDA. And so in wholesale production, these types of products have been having HACCP plans for decades. And the HACCP model is a type of food safety plan that looks at specific hazards associated with the process of the food to make sure that we can put controls in place to ensure the safety of the product. And the concept's been around since the 50s, invented with Pillsbury, the Natick Army, and NASA. When we were starting to put astronauts up in space, we realized, oh geez, it'd be really bad if we had a foodborne illness while in space. What are things that we could do? So HACCP in concept is a methodical and systematic approach where potential food safety hazards are identified and then also minimized or controlled to prevent occurrences with those associated hazards. In addition to that, there are other products that have other regulations. So products like low acid and acidified canned foods. So things like low acid or products that have a low pH, things like lentil soup or pumpkin, canned pumpkin, things that are shelf stable and put in a container that has no oxygen, has great shelf life. That follows a different canning regulation. It's known as CFR 113, low acid foods. And then the other one is acidified foods. So if you're canning things like pickles or salsas or barbecue sauces, those have a different regulation. So they have a canning rule plus food safety rule. And then the final thing here is this preventive controls rule. So this is the newest one. It's the newest regulation. And basically what it is saying is in the world of food safety, if you didn't fall under the purple, blue, orange, or green categories, you now, since 2015, have this regulation of food safety plan management. So in the world of preventive controls, it models the concepts of HACCP, but it broadens the scope. And so in HACCP, hazard analysis of critical control points, you look at your actual process, and you identify what are the concerns associated with that hazard, and you find a way to control them with a specific critical limit. So in the world of juice, for example, we will often pasteurize with heat to kill any vegetative pathogens at a specific temperature for a specific time. And so the critical control point will be the actual time and temperature that you have to hit to control the safety of the food product. In the world of preventive controls, they widen the scope. So not only do we talk about those process controls, which is very much like the CCPs in HACCP, but we have three other entities that we look at to establish parameters and values. So we're not going to go into a deep dive here on all these aspects today, but as a moment ago, Nicole was talking about the importance of declaring allergens. Allergens a chemical hazard. And now with the mission with preventive controls is we can't process that out, but we can do intentional things like making sure we check the label that the allergens are in fact declared on the product. We can think about scheduling to make sure that we do the least allergenic product first. We can have a strong cleaning and sanitation program. And so these are different elements that we intentionally put in play with records and control to make sure that we create a safe food supply. So in the world of food regulation, It's important to note that this preventive control rule is one regulation that has come about in more recent statute due to a regulation or an act that happened in about 2011, known as FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act. And so, as I mentioned here, there are 7. There's the produce rule, preventive controls rule, as well as foreign supply, third-party audits for foreign facilities, preventive controls for animal food, intentional adulteration, and sanitary transport. So there are 7 different regulations, but I think that's important to note today is focusing on number 2, the preventive controls for human food. So as I just mentioned a moment ago, we're talking specifically about this preventive control rule here, this red pillar. And so again, it is similar to HACCP in terms of identifying safety control points of your food, but it widens the scope, okay? And so as Nicole had mentioned before, GMPs, good manufacturing practices, she kind of gave a shout out, all these hit lists of these different elements that are required by law to be looking at, and she highlighted those elements and what to do about them. And in this new regulation with the preventive controls rule, it includes GMPs and specific preventive controls. So for the next couple of slides, I just want to kind of cruise through and showing you the connection between how GMPs, good manufacturing practices, are the foundation, and then integrate that about how you're looking at some controls for your food product. And so training is one of the key components to complying with good manufacturing practices and the preventive controls. And if you saw during Nicole's talk, every time she was talking about GMPs, I was threading the chat with some resources that if you haven't been on the books as trained, today's class is, if I heard Autumn correctly, you will get a training certificate, and this would count as an example of training. And then I gave you 2 other resources that you could share. The first one was free from the University of New Mexico State, but there's also one from Cornell. I'm not here to advocate that you must use those. I just wanted to give you a few examples of the types of trainings that you can then use as records for training, because within this regulation, training your employees is a requirement. And then, as Nicole had highlighted a moment ago, the GMPs have to be in play. And then when we start building your food safety plan, we conduct this thing called a hazard analysis, which looks at our hazards for biological, chemical, and physical hazards. And then if we find a hazard, we then have to control them. And then we need a way to monitor to make sure that we're doing it correctly, and then keep our records. So back to the juice, for example, if we knew that we were making some product like juice, well, that falls under the HACCP, but let's say we wanted to make a blended beverage. We know that there'd be a lot of fruits and vegetables harbor a lot of different types of microbial concerns, but one way we could control it is the pasteurization. And so we could use the heat step, that processing heat step, as a way to control it. And then we could monitor it with a thing like a calibrated thermometer, and then have records to show that the people understand why they're measuring the time and temperature, the records to show that we do temperature, et cetera, and verify that we're doing things correctly. So just as another highlight, this training thing, I point to my heart. It should be, as a processor, training should be in your heart of hearts of how do we demonstrate that you're doing processing of food safely. It's making sure that you have your team trained. So this means your individuals in, conducting the tasks, as well as the supervisor team that's responsible for overseeing this, okay? So as a highlight here, individuals engaged in manufacturing, processing, packing, and folding of foods must be qualified to perform those tasks. So they must be instructed on how to do those specific jobs. They have to have adequate training, and someone has to supervise them to make sure that they're doing this stuff correctly. And so this might seem obvious, but I will tell you, man, I'm getting all preachy now here, but when we as food safety experts, so food safety nerds go to provide consults and support small processors, we often start to engage with inspectors and auditors. And two big things that are always a problem, citations by the regulator, is poor training and poor sanitation, indicating poorly established GMPs and a lack of established training practices. So I feel like my nagging at my daughter, right? Make sure did you wash your hands? Did you do your training? Did you do your records, right? So just some things to be thinking about how you as the processor are going to instill these things. And I would argue or encourage you to be thinking about these things now in your cottage law, even though you're working on a small scale operation, the practice should start now. And as I mentioned before, I gave you a few different resources that could help instill some of those things and start to grow your business's food safety practices with some of these basic GMPs. Another thing to be thinking about is, so today I want to introduce you to this rule about preventive controls in hopes for you to be aware about what food safety plans are. And assuming that a large portion of you today will fall likely in part into the preventive controls, to be aware of what this rule is. In a moment, I'll show you how that process operates. But another thing to be thinking about too is that if and or when you become federal regulated, you need to know that there are some exemptions to the preventive controls rule. And so for very small businesses, it's just important to highlight that if you are qualified to be exempt from a portion of the rule, you do not have to have a developed written food safety plan, but you still have to follow modified rules. In particular, you have to have some sort of evidence of your exemption. This is known as an attestation. You have to follow the particular parts of subparts A and B, which is why Nicole was giving the shout out on GMPs today, and I'm giving you the reminder about employee training. And then you need to show that you're managing your hazards. And I'm here to tell you, truth serum here, every food has a hazard, even water. Everyone's got one. And you have to know what your hazards are. And we, the food safety team here, can kind of guide you into that direction if you don't know what that is. But it is your job to know. And it is your job to find a way to control it. And so in order to do that, the preventive controls process helps us think about that. And so it starts with this thing called a hazard analysis, where you look at biological, chemical, and physical hazards associated with every product ingredient and every product process. If we find a hazard, which I told you I'm sure we'll have one, we then start looking at what are some strategies that we could then control it. So as I gave an example before, the process preventive control is an example. Pasteurization is an example of a process we could implement. And then we would want to establish some sort of activity to ensure that we're doing it correctly. In this context, it would be measuring the temperature and time. And then we make records and report in written form if and or when there's a problem. We call that a corrective action and what we're going to do about it. Along the way, we also then start looking at checking our system to verify that the process is working as intended. And then this isn't just a one and done, but in the mission of food safety, on a routine basis, we review these things on a reoccurring basis, okay? So I'm not gonna go through all of these pieces here, but to just kind of introduce to you again that you as a food processor should know that you should know what the risks are, the hazards that we refer to in a food safety plan. And if you comply with the preventive controls rule, you are required to have a hazard analysis, which is a written form to show what your hazards are and why they are concerned and what you're going to do about it. And then you identify what preventive control component you're going to do, whether it be a process, an allergen, a sanitation, or a supply chain preventive control, and then include a recall plan, a monitoring, documentation, corrective actions, and verify. I guess it goes back to the cyclical process here. So to be thinking about this, we're not going to go into this wholeheartedly today, but just as a reminder, when we start thinking about hazards, we think about them in three different categories: biological, chemical, and physical. Okay, so I gave an example about pasteurization being a process control, but another one we might use is physical hazards we can control as a process using something like a metal detector. And a chemical hazard might be something like allergen controls. So you can see in this slide, there's a variety of different examples. And I don't expect you to know them all today, but rather just to introduce you to some of these concerns and give you some ideas about how you might be able to control them. Okay, so as we wrap up here today, just want to kind of give you some highlights here. So no one's exempt from food safety, and everyone should know what the hazards are with your food. And I don't care what size you are. And I will tell you here today, and I see Autumn's head shaking like, it's true, every food's got hazards. And you got to know what they are for your product and find a way to control them. And some, you know, if you're a really big operation, you might have really big, sophisticated analytical tools or processing techniques to ensure that's going to happen. But if you're small scale, there are a variety of things that you could do to reduce or minimize that risk using the resources that you have. Okay. So if, assuming that you are starting your business now and growing into this role, I feel like it's really important for you to see the trajectory so that you can start integrating these concepts now. As a consultant, it's a heart-wrenching story when I see entrepreneurs that started off small without considering food safety, and then when they go to the next level for commercialization, but they hadn't thought about their food safety controls up front, and they need to reformulate. It's a very costly and stressful situation, and I don't want that to be you. So please start thinking of what those things are, okay? So the FDA does have the power to withdraw exemptions, so you must still control your hazards associated with the product. You must still comply with GMPs, and you must still comply with training requirements. So here's just a flashback to this, you know, reminder here that every food product is different. The rules are different depending. There's all sorts of, the bottom line here, these are all food safety parameters, but how we are regulated are very different, and that you need to understand what those are as your business grows. The other thing I wanted to give a quick highlight here is that in acidified canned foods, this is the one product as an extension specialist I get the most amount of questions about. So I wanted to just take space to specify that in particular. So again, if you're doing acidified canned rules, there's a specific regulation, and you also have to comply with preventive controls. With the canning law in particular, that regulation is called CFR 114. It's the shelf stable acidified canned food law. And the gist of that is it's referring to products that are shelf stable, like pickles, salsa, barbecue sauce, pepper jelly, shelf stable, hermetically sealed products. In order to process and sell those federally, you must have the formula vetted by a process authority, and you must file with the FDA your product formulation. And someone, the operator in your team, must be trained properly on how to produce those products. Okay, so just as a pause here, to be thinking about that for your future. As we wrap up today, I just wanted to give you a highlight of some other training opportunities and or resources. So hopefully today we have introduced you to some of these concepts, and you know, you have the salt with the pepper, you got your GMPs with your preventive controls, and together you can make a fabulously spicy, delicious food. But if you need more help along the way, UMass, in collaboration with NC State and UMaine, has a sanitation program that teaches you about some fundamental back to basics about building sanitation practices, to teach you about the difference between cleaning techniques and sanitizers, how to prepare proper record keeping for that, SOPs, standard operating procedures, and how different chemistries are different for different surfaces. We also have here at UMass, I don't know if anyone's in the New England area, but UMass is going to be hosting the preventive controls class part 2 here in New England on September 26th. But there's also, in the next slide, a whole host of places. If you were in the future planning to take this, I have some links where to go for that type of class. We also have if you're new to product development, We have a virtual class that teaches you the product development life cycle of things to consider from food safety, from the concept to commercialization. As well as if you need HACCP trainings or better process control school for canning, I've given the links here about where those can be offered nationally. The final thing I want to talk to you about is that food safety resources exist. This tool guide here is known as the Processor's Food Safety Toolkit. This is offered through the Northeast Center to Advance Food Safety. It provides all these different food processing resources for small operators. So if you're new to food safety and some of these concepts we talked about today, we offer a whole bunch of things centrally located. So it's not a UMass branded thing or a UConn thing or a URI or Purdue thing. We have vetted resources and put them in one place with the idea of having it easier for small processors to access those things. So with that, I'm going to turn it over for questions. Thank you.